Dixie Cryptid, which I'm sure many of you have heard of.
Oh,
And Cameron Buckner mentioned that he was interested in publishing a Steve Willie story. And I think at that time you'd only written one. And I sent him an email and said, I can help you do that. I know how to publish. And one thing led to another, and he asked me if I'd be interested in editing his stories for him so he could get them out faster. And so that's how I got into it. After a while, he said, you know, Neoma, I like your voice. You should be doing this yourself. I thought, no. But he talked me into it, and here I sit. So I wanted to share with you some of my favorite stories from my channel tonight. Now, if you do listen to my channel, you may have heard these stories. So I'll try to beef them up and make them a little more interesting. But I don't know if any of you know where Montgomery Bell State Park is.
I live 2 miles from it.
You'll know this story then. Montgomery Bell is a very beautiful, well-groomed park. It's not like a nature thing really at all. It's more like it's just a very well-groomed park. They have a golf course. They have 3 lakes. Is it 3 lakes? It's 3 lakes.
3 lakes. I just left there yesterday.
So, and there's a swimming beach there. They have the clubhouse. It's beautiful. But at the southern end of that lake, they have a legend, and they call it Werewolf Springs. The actual name of the spring is called Hall Spring, and that's named after the family that had the farm there before it became a park. But most people know it as Werewolf Spring. Back in the 1860s, there was a farmer who was headed from west to east back to his farm, and he was passing by that area. And he was riding in his wagon with his servant, and he began to hear something that he couldn't quite identify. He felt like someone was following him. He didn't quite know what it was, but he could certainly hear the footsteps. He'd speed the wagon up a little bit, and they'd speed up with him. He'd slow the wagon down, and they'd slow down. But he could never see anything. Then he heard a blood-curdling howl. He's starting to get really panicked, and he thought, oh my God, what is this thing that's following us? And he couldn't identify it, he couldn't find it, and he couldn't get away from it. Panic started to build, and they started to go faster, and the faster they went, the faster this thing went with them, and it paced them, and paced them, and paced them, and they could not get away from it. Finally, all reason abandoned him. He jumped from the wagon this way, and the servant jumped from the wagon that way, and they both ran in different directions. And he hid in the underbrush, and he listened, while whatever was following them tracked down his servant, caught him, and ripped him to pieces. He could do nothing. He could do absolutely nothing to stop this. He could hear his servant screaming, no, let me go! But it wouldn't stop. It tore this poor man to pieces, slowly, and you could hear the flesh tearing. You could hear the bones breaking as he gnawed on it. And he couldn't do anything. And he laid there praying. When his time came, when this thing hunted him down, it would be fast. It would be faster than when his servant died. And he lay there so quietly, thinking at any moment this thing would come. But the sun rose, and it never came for him. He got up and he went to the nearest town, and he told them what happened. And these people got together a posse, and they sent all of these men out there looking for this, whatever this was. There was a rumor that there had been a circus train that had gone off the tracks, and that maybe this was an escaped animal from that train, but there's no proof of that. I could never find anything other than a newspaper article that talked about the rumor. I could never find the actual event. But these men, they got a goat, and they went to a clearing right by the spring, and they sat up and they hid in the brush around us, and I'm hoping in a semicircle, because they all had guns, and you know what happens when people shoot at each other in a circle. But they tied this goat out, and they hid in the brush, and they waited. And it was a beautiful, beautiful clear night. The sky was full of stars, the moon was big and bright, and they could see very clearly this goat in the clearing. They watched.
You go to that dog?
And they
I
waited.
gotta get my dog.
And they waited. finally, one of the men heard something moving in the brush.
It's a German Shepherd.
And they all closed in on the goat and are watching the goat. And about that time, a cloud passed over the moon and everything went dark. And they heard the goat bleat. And they could hear something clawing at the goat, and the goat was crying. And they couldn't see anything because it was dark. And then when the moon cleared, there was something very big, something huge standing there with this goat in its hand. And it was chewing on this goat. And all of the men pulled their guns and they began to fire, and every one of them emptied their rifles into this thing. And a cloud passed over the moon again. And when the cloud was gone, so was the being, so was the goat, and so was what the men. They never found it. It wasn't long after that that the
Let's
family
get over here with old
right
Jeff
there
for food.
sent their little girl out around dusk to get a bucket of water so they could do the dishes for the evening. And when she didn't come back, they went looking for her, and all they found was the bucket
Duck.
by the spring. The little girl was never found. Well, now you would think that,
Just in case you ain't
this would
recognize
make
I'll
national
play.
news, but it
I
never
feel
really did. It did
You been
eventually
doing okay?
reach the
Yeah,
ears
yeah.
of
That was a
the
good
big
song
game
you sung the other night.
And the
I
big
like
game
that
hunter
one. You was
decided
into that
if
song.
anybody could catch this thing, anybody could identify this thing, he could. Because first of all, he had hunted everywhere. He had hunted from lions in Africa to grizzly bears in the West. He knew the whole world. He could kill anything. So
Well,
he
she can tell a
shows
good
up
story, can't she?
there at the spring.
Is she,
There's
is
a
that,
cabin
the story
close
she
by.
telling, is that a
It's
true story?
cabin. It's got a
It's off her
perfect
channel.
view of the clearing. And during the day, in the morning, he went out and he tracked and tracked and tracked. And in the late afternoon, he tracked and tracked and tracked. And in between, he would sleep so that he could sit up all night and watch out the window of this clearing. And he never found anything but a set of very peculiar tracks. But he still waited, he still watched. For 6 nights, he sat watching and waiting and hoping he would see something. And on the 6th night, he was rewarded. Something incredibly large, something very hairy, and something walking on 2 legs came into that clearing. The man was so shocked he didn't even know what to think because he'd never seen anything like this before. And with his 1800s mentality, he pulled up his gun and fired at it. Of course, all this did was make it angry. It came at the cabin and he fired again, and it came at the cabin and he fired again, and it came at the cabin and he fired again, and it still kept coming. Pretty soon it's pounding on the door, and the door splinters and it flies open, and the man manages at the very last second to get all the way up into the rafters. And he's up in the rafters, and this thing is down below him, and it's jumping and it's reaching and it's growling and screaming at him. And he's looking down at it, and he's just barely out of reach, within inches. In fact, a couple of times as it reached up and it scratched at him, it actually hit his skin. And he thought, I don't know what to do. So he reached and he takes his rifle and he fires down. Nothing. The bullet didn't even penetrate. He fires again. Nothing. He fires again. Nothing. He's down to his last 2 bullets. And he's thinking, one's for it and one's for me. I've only got 1 bullet left to put in this thing, because if it doesn't work, I'm not going to let it tear me apart. And he sat up there in the rafters, and the thing paced around underneath him for hours and hours, and it would try to get to him, and it couldn't get to him. And just as he had decided to put that last bullet in the rifle and use it on himself, the sun came up, and it went away. It left. It was like it didn't want to be out in the daylight. Well, the hunter packed up his stuff, and he got out of there so fast that it'd make your head spin. He was done with that. And he had to spend the rest of his life realizing there was one animal he could not kill. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it walked on 2 legs. He knew it was about 6 or 7 feet tall, maybe even 8 feet. And he knew that it was impervious to bullets. Over time, these legends have been told again and again and again. And a lot of people say that whatever was out there is gone. But there are still a lot of people who are, when they're walking the trails on the southern will hear a strange howl they don't know. Or they'll feel like they're being paced through the woods by something they can't see. So whatever it is, I think it's still real. There's that one. So, have you ever had any experiences at Montgomery Bell?
No.
It's
No,
too
I
well
just came
groomed
through
to
for 3
think.
days this week with some friends of mine.
Yeah.
No, nothing crazy.
Have you ever been down to Werewolf Spring?
I have. I've been going to that park my whole life. My parents have about 70 acres of land, including all the way. That's what I do.
Yeah.
I mean, weird stuff happens on the farm, but nothing really to stick out.
Really? Nothing you want to talk about?
Really.
Don't trip.
Montgomery Bell is,
Don't
you
trip.
know where Dixon is?
It's between Burns and White Bluff.
Yeah, that's the best way. It's, I can't think of the name of the county. What's that county?
It's Dixon County.
Dixon
It's,
County.
right out, it's between Highway 47 and Highway 70. I think it's 4,000 or 5,000 acres. It's a pretty big park.
White Bluff is on Highway 70, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. They have their own legend, the White Bluff Spring. I think you
Over
know
here.
that one too.
No.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I mean, you know.
What have you heard on the farm?
You hear stuff.
I'm just curious. You don't have to talk about it.
I don't know. I was always told as a kid it's a bobcat.
Still trying to leash train this thing.
You never know. You get old
You
and start
tell?
thinking about stuff.
Your growling sounds or howling sounds?
It was more screaming.
Or scream?
But, you know,
Unnerving or curious?
one time when I was a kid it unnerved me a little bit, but I've never heard it again.
Really?
Did you think you were hearing the screamer when you heard the screaming, or are
It
you
was
close
the
to where?
scream that went through you versus here. You know, I mean, you felt it all the way through. I guess I was probably 16. It scared me to death.
Wow.
I mean, I run in the house and
Yeah.
dismissed it as a bobcat and all of that. I mean, my dad, mom, they don't discount things like that. But Dad has cows, and there's always a few missing every year.
Yeah.
And it's strange. I saw a big rock in the field this week, as a matter of fact, but you know, I don't know how it got there. I've been bush hogging that my whole life. I ain't never seen that rock. It looked like a basketball, but
Wow.
there it was. So I don't know. I ain't never seen anything.
Yeah.
Just that one time I heard it. That's the only thing, and I can't. I don't know. That was a long time ago.
Now, do you live? I know where White Bluff is, and I know where Montgomery Bell is. Which do you live closer to? I know that
So
White
mom
Bluff
and
is
dad
like
have a
right.
Burns address and a White Bluff phone number.
Okay.
They're right there. If you go out of the south side of Montgomery Bell State Park and go across the road, they're about a mile and a half that way.
Okay. Never
They live right there.
Well, the next story I want to tell you actually happened in my neck of the woods in Robertson County. Most people know Robertson County as the home of the Bell Witch up in Adams. That's north of Springfield. But there's another legend in Robertson County that interests me a lot more because it's very close to my house. And that is the critter of Carr Creek. Now this critter, nobody's ever actually gotten a good view of, except one man, well, a couple of people. But most people never get a good view of it. They hear it, and they know that it's been around. They've seen its footprints. But I personally think that the critter of Carr Creek is a dog meat. I'll tell you that before I start. Nobody's ever labeled it anything, but I'll tell you the story. Quite a few years ago, probably around the 1950s, there was a farmer. He was a cattle farmer. It was about this time of year. He was out wandering in the pasture, looking at the cattle, and basically just kind of gauging the grazing land, whether thinking about whether or not he had enough hay put away, and what cattle he had to move from what pasture to what pasture. And he had his dog with him. And he happened to notice that his dog was acting a little bit weird. And this was the bravest dog he'd ever had. He didn't imagine what was had this dog so spooked. But it kept looking over at the tree line. He was probably about 50 yards or so from the trees. And he kept looking and trying to figure out what the heck that dog was looking at. But he could not, for the life of him, figure out dog starts kind of putting its head down and whimpering. And this is just not behavior for this dog. He's never seen it act this way. And all of a sudden, there was about 5 or 6 cows over there, steer actually, over there, and they bolted and they started kicking, and they all ran for the gate clear over at the other opposite end of the pasture. And he thought, what on earth has made these cattle act this way? And no sooner did that happen than a rabbit ran past him so close he could have reached out and grabbed it. Now you guys know a rabbit doesn't usually run to a human. It usually runs away from us. And he couldn't understand. And then the dog put its head down and it growled. And it put its tail between its legs and it turned and ran to the gate. That was when he knew there was something that didn't make sense, and he looked straight ahead of him and he saw it. He realized immediately why he couldn't see it before, because this thing was brown. It had darker brown stripes on it that made it look like shadows in the underbrush, and it was really well camouflaged. But he could tell that this thing had a hump, and it was big. It was bigger than anything he'd ever seen in the area that could even come close to that description. In fact, the more he stared at it, the more he thought, that's a hyena. That's just a really big hyena. But what in the world would a hyena be doing in Tennessee? And it started moving towards him. Well, at this point, the farmer panicked and he takes off running back to the gate where the cattle have gone, where the dog's gone. And he's running and he's thinking to himself, is it following me? I don't know. And he looked back. And it was coming out of the woods, but it wasn't really chasing him, but it was definitely following him. And from that point forward, panic just erased everything. And the next thing he knew, he was standing on his porch. And he's looking around himself and he's thinking, did I jump the fence? Did I stop and open the gate? I couldn't have. I'd had to move all the animals away. How did I get here? What happened? And he was so afraid that it blocked his mind from being able to think about it or even remember what he had done. But all he knew is now he was on his front porch. He was looking across the road at the pasture, and he felt safe. The pasture led to a copse of trees, and on the other side of that trees was Car Creek. Well, this farmer, he wasn't about to tell anybody what he'd seen. He didn't want anybody to think he was crazy. He didn't want to admit that he was afraid of something. He didn't want anybody ever to know about this, so he never said anything for a good probably a dozen years. Then in 1966, a farmer not too far down the road from him had his own incident. This guy was a hog farmer, and he was out trying to figure out why in the world these hogs would not eat grain he put out for them. They all seemed so nervous, and it was dark, and he was a little concerned that he brought them in. He had one of those. It was more just like a pavilion. It was open-sided pavilion, and they were all under there, but they would not eat, and he couldn't figure it out. I mean, it's one thing to scare a dog into running away, but who ever heard of scaring a hog out of eating? That's what they do best. And he thought, well, what's going on here? And then he heard something over in the brush, not too far away from the edge of the barn, and he thought, well, maybe there's something out there that's got him startled. Well, in Tennessee, there aren't a whole lot of things that could have got him too startled, but so he wasn't too worried about that. And they were fairly well protected in this area. So he's looking at the grain and he's kind of watching the hogs. They're acting nervous and they're grunting and squealing like hogs will do. And he heard a howl, and it just was piercing. And all of a sudden he realized he was just a little bit closer to that brush than he wanted to get to that tree. And he started thinking, I need to get to the house. Now, he didn't have a weapon with him, so he picked up his grain scoop, his big shovel, and he thought, this is all I got. And he heads off to the house. He ran he had a big light in the middle of the barnyard and sat over his fuel tank. He ran to that, stopped and put the rest in. And he could see the side porch of the house, and he could see with a light shining through the kitchen door. And that's where he needed to go. It's all that mattered to him. He needed to get to the house. But he happened to look over this way towards the kitchen room, and he saw something in the shadows. He didn't see it clear enough to tell what it was, but it was big. This thing wasn't on 4 legs. It was up walking on 2 legs. He just bolted and ran. He got to the house, he's out of breath, and his wife looks at him and says, "What in the world is wrong with you?" And he says, "I gotta call the cops." He picks up the phone, he calls the police. Of course, back then they didn't have 911, so he calls the operator. Operator, give him the police, the police, Robertson County Police Department. And they get on the phone with him, and he says, "There's something out in my barnyard. It's got my hog scared. It's big, it's scary. I don't know what it is. You get someone out here, and you do it right now." And he was so frightened, he almost hung up the phone before he got to tell him who he was or where they should come. But he got it out. Of course, the police, they thought this man's lost his mind. But they sent a deputy out, and they looked around. In fact, the next day, they even sent out a couple more to look around. They never found anything but some really big paw prints with very long claws. So, of course, now this man, he'd have told the police, and the police weren't going to let him live it down, so they told quite a few people, and the story started going around that there was something in Car Creek. Something that lived along Car Creek that was coming up. And more stories started coming out. There was a man who happened to be out, he wanting to hunt this farmer's land, and he was out walking it, and he saw something on the side of the creek that he wasn't close enough to identify, but he was close enough to think that if he got any closer, he might be that thing's meal, so he left. There was a woman who happened to be out in the backyard hanging her laundry out, and she saw something jump the pond out of in the pasture next to the house. This thing didn't jump a fence, and it didn't jump a little circle pond like you might think. This is a pretty good sized pond, and this thing jumped it. She said she didn't know what it was. She said it kind of looked like a mix between a bobcat and a coyote, but it was very, very big. And she said it could, they jumped from one side to the other, and it didn't even get killed. A little bit after that, around the 4th of July, there was a couple that was out picnicking. They decided to get away from the crowd. They were, young lovers and all that sweet stuff. And they happened to be out in the crowd. And they were out in the woods, and they were having a nice picnic. And the man said to the woman, "Oh, honey, let's go for a nice walk." And so they started going for a walk, and they're walking through the woods. And they couldn't help but notice that they could hear something that sounded like it was following. They weren't quite sure what it was, but it was definitely following. So they kind of steered over this way, and it steered over this way with them. And then it steered over this way, and they followed it. And they started getting a little bit nervous, but after a few minutes, it finally kind of stopped. And they thought, well, who knows? It could have been just an oversized raccoon. I'm curious. Until they got back to their little picnic spot. And the whole place was torn up. And the tablecloth that they had laid out was covered in great big paw prints with really long claws. Whatever it was had gotten into their picnic basket and all of the leftovers food, and it had just completely destroyed their whole campus. Now the stories went on and on through 1966. In fact, there was even a couple of kids up in Bowling Green, which is about 50 miles north of there, who had run back to their dad while they were playing at the park there. What's the park? Beach Bend? Is that it? In Bowling Green. There's a park there. I think it's Beach Bend Park. And they said, yeah, we saw a hyena. We chased this hyena. We tried to catch it. And the dad's like, not North America, you did. They don't live here. And they said, well, that's what it looked like, Dad. That's what it had to be. Well, the police came out and they searched the area just in case, somebody had an animal that they shouldn't legally have. And they never found it. But again, they found the paw prints 50 miles north of Car Creek. seems to be an even year, every 2 or 4 years.
Big cat engine.
Somebody else reports something. that they
Caterpillar
heard,
engine going
they
through there.
saw, or an unusual cattle, number of cattle that have disappeared. And I also want you to think about this.
We got an 8-inch pipe over
You
there
head
through it.
northeast or northwest of Robertson County, Park Creek ends just south of Springfield. You end up in the land between the lakes. Now, anybody that knows anything about Bigfoot and Dogman know that on the southern half of the land between the lakes, that's where you see all the Bigfoot sightings, and all the Dogmen are to the north. I will tell you this though, I was there right about this time last year, my husband and I. We were driving to another group meeting like this, and I happened to glance up. We were going down towards the lake that's on the west side. Is that Barkley? Or is that Kentucky Lake? Anyway, and the hill was sloping up this way, and I looked out the window, and I saw something that to this day, I cannot tell you what I saw. I don't know. I wish I could tell you I saw a Bigfoot, or I saw a Dogman, or I saw a mangy coyote, or I saw an oversized bobcat, or I saw Donald Duck in a sailor suit. I don't know what I saw. What I do know is that it ran even with our car for about 5 steps, and then it turned. The trees were still like this, so it was still heavy brush, and it just got swallowed up by the brush, and I only saw it for a second. But I can tell you this: it wasn't a Bigfoot, and it's not that far from Car Creek. The critter of Car Creek. Don't you love that name, the critter of Car Creek? How am I doing on time, man? All right. Let me see. Has anybody ever heard of Moss Mountain in Arkansas?
Say it again?
Moss Mountain?
Not familiar.
Moss Mountain is just outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. It's on the Arkansas River. Today there's a farm there. It is probably one of the most beautiful estates I've ever seen in my life. It's owned by a man named P. Allen Smith, who anybody who's ever done any gardening might know, because for years he's had gardening shows on PBS where he teaches people how to garden, and he walks them through his gardens. He's actually one of my favorite people, gardening wise. And to be politically incorrect, I won't be. Yeah, I will. He's just my favorite little gay guy. He says he's not gay, but I'm telling you he's gay. Anyway, back in the 1800s, when the Louisiana Purchase first occurred, of course, there were explorers who went out and explored all of this. And there was a man named Thomas Nuttall. Now, Thomas Nuttall came to the United States in 1808, and he came to Philadelphia. And he met Professor Smith Barton there, who was the United States preeminent botanist at the time. He wrote the first book on natural science in the United States. And Nuttall had spent his youth apprenticing to become a printer. But he had lost interest in that, and he had this desire just to go west and to explore the world. And when he got to Philadelphia, Professor Smith Barton pushed him towards doing exactly that. And so he sent him out on an expedition. He went up the Great Lakes, up into Manitoba, and then back down through the upper Mississippi Valley and the Missouri Valley. And he came back. He had sent back quite a few plants and specimens with Lewis and Clark, who managed to lose them. But he got such an amazing collection of specimens and identified so many plants in the United States that, even Smith Barton was impressed by it. And this is what he knew, that this was his love. He loved the frontier. He loved going out doing this. He loved going on these expeditions. And so he planned on going on quite a few more. Unfortunately, between 1808 and 1812, things were not so hot between the United States and England. War broke out, as we know. We all know the song. And he went back to England. And he stayed there until 1815. He came back to the United States at that time. Now, at the same time that they were fighting us, England was also fighting France, Napoleon. And in fact, the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1812. And so Nuttall wasn't a big fan of the French, and Americans weren't necessarily big fans of the English. So he comes to the United States, and of course, Smith Barton sends him out on another expedition. He says, go down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, and up the Arkansas River. We want to know everything you can find out about that. Of course, this was a territory that had all been settled by France originally. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Manitoba, Quebec, all of these areas had all been French, and he wasn't a real fan of the French. So most of the first parts of his journal are him complaining about all of these lying, thieving, drunken, worthless, so on and so forth, French people. And it made all of his American comrades who were going with him kind of hate him and think, well, you know, you're just a pansy Englishman. What do you know? And so there was a little bit of resentment there. But interestingly, Nuttall, he made first contact with many of the native tribes in America, especially of the Arkansas area. And he collected a huge amount of specimens again, identified quite a few. This isn't a man who was a pansy. Okay. Halfway down the Mississippi, though, he and members of his party did have malaria. Now, the symptoms of malaria were really bad headaches, nausea, vomiting, night sweats, fever, and a little bit of hallucinating. And so what I'm about to tell you could very easily be, put aside as a hallucination, except that there were 5 witnesses. They were headed up the Arkansas River, and they got to an island that today is called Beaver Dam Island. And it sits in the Arkansas River. And if I say Mississippi River instead of Arkansas River, forgive me. I was born and raised on the Mississippi, and that's the natural word in front of river for me. They're headed up the Arkansas River. They get to Beaver Dam Island. They decide to pull in their flatboats. They decide that they're going to camp there for the night. Now, a lot of the natives that they'd met in the area, many of the First Nations peoples were very friendly and absolutely helpful. Others, not so much. To the point that they knew that they couldn't just all camp around the fire at night, okay? October 31st, 1819. They build a big fire. The men sit around the fire, much like we are today. They have their meal, they drink their coffee, they have a good conversation. And one by one, little by little, they all drift off to go to sleep. Now, because they know better than to camp all together, sleep all together in a row, many of the men, not all one of them, slept off in the perimeter under the brush and in a way where they wouldn't be easily seen. Others camped very close to the fire, where they could easily get up and stoke the fire and throw in a few logs to keep them warm, because, as I stated, many of these men were still suffering with malaria, and they were still feeling sick at night, and they felt the need to be warm. And this is October 31st, and even in Arkansas, it gets a little chilly at night, October 31st. The middle of the night, Nuttall wakes up, and he hears this, ah! And he looks up, and he's looking around, and of course his eyes are blurry, and he's having a night sweat, and he's like, what is that sound? And he's looking, and he sees a huge being pass in front of the fire.
Scared me.
You got me too.
Let me jump.
I did my job. I can go home now. Anyway, and he's looking around, and he hears, no, stop! And he looks around again, and what is this? What is it? And you can see these very large bipedal beings moving in the fire. He can see them passing back and forth. And he sees one pick up one of his men and throw him to the ground. And he hears the crack of the man's back breaking. And he hears the man crying and wailing as he hears the crunching of bones as this thing bites into the man. And he's watching, and he's trying really hard to identify what he's seeing. These men are being torn to pieces, and he can't figure out by what. He thinks, are they bears? But no, they wouldn't be bears, because when they're done with one man, they walk on two legs to the next, and bears would have dropped to all fours to do that, unless they're trained otherwise. He's thinking, are they bobcats? No, bobcats don't get up on two legs at all. And these things are massive. And he laid there and he watched, because that's all he could do. What, if he went in and fought, he would die too. One by one, little by little, these things tear his men apart. At some point, Nuttall, either from fear or exhaustion or from the sickness, he finally passed out. Assuming that this was the last night of his life, that he would eventually be found. He gets up the next morning, surprised to be alive, cannot believe he survived the night, and he crawls out into the camp, and there's a man laying just off on the edge, and he crawls over to him and touches him, and the man's alive. And he recognizes him. He's one of his scouts, and he shakes him and says, wake up, wake up. And the man opens his eyes and says, what happened? Man, I don't know. I woke up and something was throwing me, and I hit my head, and I never saw anything. I don't know what happened. He says, you don't know what did this to you? He says, I don't know. I don't know. Well, Nuttall manages to get over to the fire, and he finds the coffee pot, and he starts the morning coffee, and he gets himself a cup, and he gets this guy a cup, and in the meantime, 3 other men crawl out of the brush. 5 men of the entire expedition survived. None of them could identify what had attacked them. They managed to get back to civilization, and it was reported, and you can read all of the papers from them, that what they were attacked by was bears. Nuttall and his men, to the day they died, said it could not have been bears. Bears would not have walked around that camp. They would have dropped down on their fours. Has anybody else ever heard that story? Because I was really surprised to learn that a lot of people had never heard about Moss Mountain. To me, that seems like one of the earliest Bigfoot encounters that we have in our country. No?
First time I ever heard about that when I saw the mountain.
Yeah?
I have a buddy of mine used to live out the Middle Rock.
Yeah? Have you been to the farm?
I never got to go there.
Yeah. It's beautiful though. I mean, it is absolutely gorgeous. P. Allen Smith hosts a party every October to celebrate October and Halloween.
Yeah.
And he says that every year you can hear the men that were killed on the island. You can hear their screams come up from the river.
Now, I was listening on the way up here, actually, to the Dogman Encounter podcast.
Yeah.
They was talking about dogmen up there.
In around Little Rock, or
Yeah.
really? I've never heard of dogmen in Arkansas. Maybe that's what it was. I don't know. I just assumed it was a Bigfoot encounter.
It was on Beaver Island, Beaver Dam Island.
Yeah? Well, there you go, folks. I just assumed it was Bigfoot. And I just thought that was such an odd thing when I first read about it, probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I was reading about Thomas Nuttall.
Bigfoot would be a rogue Bigfoot.
And I
Yeah.
thought,
A lot
how
of people
odd
pissed
is it
off.
that
A
is
lot
not
of
a
people
legendary
mistake that
story
dogman
in
as
the community,
Bigfoot.
because it's been out there for 200 years, and almost no one has heard it,
Instead of bear.
which I think is really
dog
kind of
man.
strange.
I'm going to look that up on Google when I get home.
Yeah, Thomas Nuttall, Nuttall. And
I'll find you on Facebook so we can keep in touch about that.
okay. I have a page on there, so look up Neoma Finn. We'll talk about it, because I would love to know.
You know what? Because I got bad ears.
Neoma Finn on Facebook. Look me up. So,
Oh, so that's a true hillbilly over there.
Check the notes. That's right.
That's right.